Hello and welcome to this talk entitled Taking Place, Exploring Dialect in Literature. My name is Dr. David Peplow. I'm a senior lecturer in English language at Sheffield Hallam University. That's my picture in the top right hand corner of the screen. So this talk lasts about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. I'm going to focus on representations of dialect in literature, so how writers go about representing different voices of characters in literary fiction, particularly novels. And this talk is particularly aimed at students who are thinking about coming to university and studying for any sort of English degree. So without any further ado, let's get started. So we're going to start with an extract from a novel. We're going to look at three different extracts in this talk. So this is the start of Adam Thorpe's novel entitled Alderton. He appeared on the hill at first light. The scarp was dark against a greening sky, and there was the bump of the barrow, and then the figure, and it shocked. I thought perhaps the warrior buried there had stood up again to haunt us. I thought this as I blew out the lanterns, one by one, around the pen. The sheep jostled, and I was glad of their bells. So that's one of the extracts we're going to look at today. There are two others, and really what we're looking at is focusing on is how writers go about creating place in literature. So we'll return to this extract again in a couple of slides' time. Okay, so just to sort of get us started and sort of giving ourselves some ways of talking about place in literature. It's kind of obvious to say that in our everyday lives and in literature, everything that happens has to take place somewhere. So everything that we experience has to take place somewhere, and it has to take place in some time as well. So we are sort of bound by place and time. And this is, as I say, this is true in our everyday lives. So events have to take place somewhere. So, we might go through different places and spaces in one day. So, from a school to the cafe, to the park, to the shops, to our friend's house, to our house. And in our everyday lives, where we are, where we're situated, the place we're in is usually quite obvious to us, because we can sort of tell from our surroundings, from the way things look maybe, or the way things smell, or what we can hear, or kind of who we're with. We can obviously, the vast majority of the time, we know where we are. Literature is a little bit different from that, in the sense that writers must produce this sense of place for the reader. And they must produce this sense of place for the reader almost from nothing. So in literature, place needs to be created from the words primarily, from the words on the page. So there are two ways that writers can do this, mainly. Two ways that they can create place. The first way is through description. So we'll just return to the start of Alderton by Adam Thorpe, which was the extract I presented to you a moment or two ago. So in this particular extract, it's clear that the writer is sort of using description to kind of set the scene in this novel. So it's from the very beginning of the novel, and as readers we can pick up on certain clues about where and when this scene is set. So if you just have a sort of a quick read through it again, if you just want to pause the video and just have a quick read through it, and then restart it again when you're ready. Okay, so you'll have probably noticed that we've probably come to the conclusion that it seems to be a rural setting, so a countryside setting as opposed to a urban town or city setting. So it seems to be rural, and we can pick up on certain clues. So hill, perhaps, scarp, which is on that first line, scarp, which is short for escarpment, meaning a steep slope. Barrow, which is on the third line, which means a raised heap of earth, and sheep as well on the penultimate line. So those are things that hill, scarp, barrow, sheep are things that words that we might associate with more with a rural setting than with an urban setting, perhaps. It's also, the description also maybe gives us some sense of when this is taking place as well. So not just where, but when. Again, there are certain clues. The word warrior perhaps is associated more with the past. That's on the fourth line. The act of blowing out the lanterns on the third and second from last lines. The act of blowing out lanterns seems to be a sort of a thing we probably wouldn't do today. A thing that's associated with sort of previous technologies, the past. And the sheep wearing bells is again not just indicative of a rural setting, but maybe a rural setting in the past, a sort of farming practice of the past rather than the present. Okay, so description is one way that writers can go about creating place, and that's kind of what we would typically think is sort of the predominant way that writers will go about creating place is through description. So the second way, main way that writers create place, and and the way that we as readers create place as well in our minds, is through the voices of the characters in fictional works. So the way that we speak can give others a lot of information about us. For example, it can give people information. The way we speak can give people information about where we're from, perhaps how old we are, what social class we belong to, all sorts of different elements of our identity may be contained in the way that we speak. So most languages are made up of tens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of different dialects, and dialects usually refers to different ways of speaking that are to do with region. So within the UK, there are many different regional dialects, and everyone speaks in a particular dialect, and that is often to do with the region that they're from or the region that they live in. So Jane Hodson has a nice definition of dialect, which is that it's a variety of language that is associated with a particular region and or social class. Then she goes on to write that a dialect is a combination of regional pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. So, in other words, a dialect is a type of language that is associated with a certain region, so a certain kind of area of the country, and or it may be to do with social class as well. And she says that that a dialect is a combination of pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. And we're going to focus on those three aspects of language, those three elements of language: pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. When we look at the next two extracts from literary texts. Okay, so the next extract we're going to look at is from a very famous novel, Bleak House by Charles Dickens. This particular extract is taken from chapter 6 of the novel, and it's an exchange between a police constable and Joe. So Joe is a poor, illiterate orphan who tries to make a living as a crossing sweeper, but is always on the verge of starvation. Joe is always being moved on by the police. His only home is Tom All Alone's, a Victorian slum. There are other characters present during the conversation, including the middle-class Mr. Snagsby, to whom Joe refers. But really, what we're focusing on particularly is the way that Joe speaks in this extract, and indeed throughout the novel, the voice that he's given by the author Charles Dickens. So if you just pause the video and have a quick read through it, maybe read through it a couple of times, and then I've got a couple of questions for you to think about. But if you just have a read through it, and then start the video again when you're ready. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to read through that at least once. So on the next slide, I've actually got an etching representing Joe, the crossing sweeper. So Joe's the character on the right there. So I've got a couple of questions concerning this particular extract for you to think about, and then once you've had a chance to think through your answers to these questions, I'll just give my view on what I think about them. Okay, so in the earlier quotation from Jane Hodson, she notes that pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar are all important in creating a particular dialect. So, thinking about that, we've got two questions. So, what is noticeable about the pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar in the Bleak House extract? And second question, how does Dickens use dialect to distinguish between the social class of Joe and that of the police constable? So question one, what is noticeable about the pronunciation, vocabulary and grammar in the Bleak House extract? And question two, how does Dickens use dialect to distinguish between the social class of Joe and that of the police constable? So you may need to go back to the slide with the extract on, and just have a think about your answers to those two questions. So pause the video, have a think about your answer to those two questions, and then restart it, and we can compare what we've got. Okay, so question one, what is noticeable about the pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar in the Bleak House extract? So I'll just go back. There we go. So we're back on the extract now. Okay, so Joe's dialect seems to be removed from standard English, seems to be different from standard English. It's certainly different from the way that the constable speaks. And it seems that Dickens is sort of trying to create a certain dialect in the voice of Joe. So this is mainly achieved through Dickens's representation of Joe's pronunciation. So it's on that pronunciation element of dialect that Joe's distinctive voice is most clear. So his pronunciation of certain words, so sovereign instead of sovereign, whale instead of veil, says instead of says, burying instead of burying, house instead of house. So there are other examples as well. That's just some of them, but it's on that kind of pronunciation level that you kind of that we can see the most difference from standard English. Joe also uses some vocabulary that Dickens associates with the Victorian poor, which he's representing here. For example, bob, which meaning a shilling, and square it, which means to settle a matter. So the voice, the dialect that Dickens is sort of trying to create here is an example of a kind of Victorian London poor. So so Joe is meant to represent one part of that Victorian London poor. So the regional dialect that he's trying to recreate here is that sort of almost inner city London poor. So we can see that through the pronunciation and vocabulary, some differences with standard English. Also, the grammar of Joe's sentences is marked to be different from standard English. So you'll have probably noticed that he uses "and" a lot. So about 2/3 the way down. And she says to me, "Do it," and I done it, and she gave me a sovereign, and I hooked it, and I hadn't had much of the sovereign neither. So this style is called parataxis. This kind of parataxis style, paratactic style, is sometimes associated with the speech of children. So we can kind of see the ways in which the pronunciation, the vocabulary and the grammar is sort of going towards creating a certain type of character from a certain region belonging to a certain social class, and all the kind of the associations that kind of rightly or wrongly go along with that. So hopefully you've kind of picked out some of the same things. You might have found other things as well in terms of pronunciation, vocabulary and grammar. But we'll move on to question 2, to your responses to question 2. So thinking about the sort of the differences between Joe's voice and the voice of the constable. So overall, the effects of these choices means that Joe's speech is much more like spoken language than it is like written language, and this really sort of distinguishes Joe from a police constable. So while Joe's speech seems much more similar to the way that people speak, in reality, the way the police constable speaks is kind of more like the way that people write. So this distinguishes Joe from a police constable in one way. So we might note for further thinking that throughout the novel, Dickens constructs Joe as a sort of highly sentimental figure, and an object of pity and compassion. And you can kind of see this from this particular extract, that if you've read the novel, then you'll know that Joe is kind of constructed very much as a sort of very sentimental character. He's represented in a very sort of sentimental way. And that is kind of designed to evoke sympathy from a reader. The narrator's descriptions of Joe often draw attention to his ragged appearance and his frequent hunger. Despite his poverty, however, Joe is always good in his deeds and actions, something I think you get a sense of from this extract as well. And he's always willing to oblige and help others. So it has been kind of noted that Joe symbolises social neglect in Victorian England, but particularly the idea of a deserving poor. So this idea of a deserving poor as opposed to an undeserving poor. The deserving poor was a Victorian idea that some of the poor, like Joe, were naturally good and therefore not to blame for their poverty. The undeserving poor, by contrast, were those Victorians deemed as not good and were at fault for their circumstances. Okay, so we're going to now move on to the third extract, and we're going to look at similar things as we've just looked at for Bleak House. So this is a more recent example, and it comes from the very start of a great novel called The Lonely Londoners, which is by Sam Selvon. So again, just like the Alderton example, this example is taken right from the start of the novel. So as the title of the novel suggests, The Lonely Londoners, the setting here is London. More specifically, this novel focuses on the lives of groups of Caribbean migrants who, after World War II, have come over to live in England. Okay, so just take a few minutes just to read through this extract. Read it as many times as you want, and then again, there's a couple of questions for us to work through. Okay, so if you've read through that extract from The Lonely Londoners, here are some questions. So, what do you notice about the narrator's voice? Are there any expressions that stand out to you? And thinking about vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar used in this extract, in what ways is the voice different from a typical narrator? Okay, so just have a think about those questions. Again, you might want to pause the video and go back to the extract, and just have a think about those particular questions, and then when you restart the video, I'll give my views on it, and you can see if you agree. Okay, so if I just share my responses to those questions. Okay, so in terms of this extract from The Lonely Londoners, I think the narrator's voice is obviously different from standard English, although it's certainly not as markedly different as the voice of Joe from Bleak House. So, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the main characters in Selvon's novel are of Caribbean descent, and the author makes decisions in his writing to attempt to recreate this particular dialect. So the voice of the narrator is created through the way that the words are pronounced. Fella for fellow, for example, in this particular extract. Dialect vocabulary is also used, such as the word unrealness on that first line. Most striking, however, is the use of non-standard grammar to represent this Caribbean dialect. So in the example, Moses Oleta hop on a number 46 bus, where the third person subject, Moses Oleta, does not agree, in traditional terms, with the verb hop. So in standard English, we would expect to read Moses Oleta hops rather than hop. So there's that particular kind of subject and verb agreement that is different from standard English. Secondly, the deletion of a pronoun it in the example, as if is not London at all, as opposed to as if it is not London at all, which we would expect in a more standard English form. So you've got the deletion of it, and then thirdly, you've got the blending. You might have noticed the blending of verb forms as well. There's the example, he was to get up from a nice warm bed. So there are various ways in which I think in this particular extract, it's the grammar that kind of feels a bit different from standard English, whereas in the Bleak House example, it was pronunciation particularly that was sort of marked as being different from standard English. So overall, so sort of thinking about effect and sort of how this voice is different, you might have kind of thought about the effect of these choices. It seems to me that the effect of the choices that the author's made is that the passage seems more like spoken language than written language. Sort of similar to the way to Joe's voice in Bleak House. This seems a bit more like spoken than it does written language. So there seems to be a genuine attempt from the author, who was himself a migrant of a what's called the Windrush generation from the Caribbean to the UK. There seems to be a genuine attempt to create an authentic Caribbean voice in this novel. So we can see again the way that dialect can be used to create place. The overall effect of this writing is that we, as readers, are sort of placed in a particular community in this particular case in mid-20th century London. Perhaps this effect would have been possible with the use of more standard forms of expression. The way that the text is written certainly adds to this sort of sense of placing us to a great extent, I think. Okay, so that's the 3 extracts, and thinking about kind of how place is created in literature more generally. So just sort of bringing things together a little bit and sort of comparing the 2 extracts, you might want to think about these two. You might want to think about these questions. So, which representation of characters or a voice do you think is the most accurate? Which is the most flattering on the character or characters being described? What do you think the 2 authors are trying to achieve? Are they trying to achieve the same thing or something rather different? So those are just things for you to kind of think about as a kind of extension exercise from the things that we've just discussed and things that we've just looked at. Okay, so that's it from me. If you want to get in contact with me, then you've got my email address on this slide. Hope you enjoyed this task. I should also say that Dr. Sue McPherson, also from English, did a lot of work on the Bleak House example. So I want to say thanks to Sue for helping me out with that. So if you've got any questions or you want to get in contact, just drop me an email. I'm happy to talk about this further if you want to. Okay. Thank you for your time. Hope you enjoyed it. And goodbye.